Hi, my name is Amanda Avila Kaminski, and I am an INFEMIT board member and assistant professor of theology at Texas Lutheran University in San Antonio, Texas in the US, where I also serve as the director of the program in social innovation and social entrepreneurship. My presentation for today is entitled Spiritual Practices for Discerning Prophetic Action in the Context of Empire. A trauma-informed reading of the disobedience of Esther. The time may be ripe in the church for serious consideration of prophecy as a crucial element in ministry. The biblical prophets understood the possibility of change as linked to the emotional extremities of life. They understood the strange incongruence between public conviction and personal yearning. And most of all, they understood the distinctive power of language. It is the aim of every totalitarian effort to stop the language of newness. And we are now learning that where such language stops, we find our humanness diminished. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, penned this introduction to a series of lectures in 1978. And yet, this call for prophetic imagination rings as true today as ever, with the rise of dangerous Christian nationalisms, intractable political polarities, psychological malaise, and new forms of fascism in governments worldwide. The perennial wisdom of Brueggemann's treatment of the ministry of Moses and the numbing effect of empire has made his text a classic, with over 1 million copies sold in 45 years of continuous print. His overarching thesis defines the function of prophecy in the context of empire by defining two crucial elements in the ministry. First, the prophet criticizes and dismantles the ruling consciousness by unveiling the illegitimacy of the present order and rejecting its acts and authority. Second, it energizes individuals and social entities with an alternative vision of reality for which the community can yearn, hope, and thus begin to realize. While Brueggemann's project focuses on Moses, my presentation builds on his call for a deeper examination of biblical models that cultivate prophetic imagination. By offering a trauma-informed reading of Esther, I will present this sacred text as paradigmatic imaginative resource, one that emphasizes the role of artistry and humor amid extremity, elucidates practices and postures for prophetic leadership, and codifies strategies for discerning socio-spiritual action in imperial context. In a shortened version of my article-length argument, this presentation will move in 3 parts that correspond directly with the tripartite structure of biblical interpretation. In part 1, I will investigate the world behind the text by examining the context that gave rise to the Liturgy of Purim to demonstrate how sarcasm, irony, and dark humor emerge as strategies for socio-political criticism. In part 2, an investigation into the literary features of doubleness, dualities, and inversions in the world of the text will elucidate 2 strategies for a trauma-informed spirituality that will yield wisdom for building resilience and prophetic imagination in the world in front of the text. To begin building the case for the scroll of Esther as a biblical model, a brief exploration of the world behind the text will uncover how the performative origins create imaginative space in the subtext of Esther for unsettling, deriding, and defying different forms of royal consciousness. Scholar Daniel Polish makes a convincing case that a phenomenological reading of the text reveals key insights into the origins of Purim, the annual celebration of the Jews that reenacts the Esther drama. He avers that the holiday of Purim is a Jewish appropriation of a non-Jewish New Year's celebration, likely the Babylonian festival of Sakai, where significant inversions of the social order occurred with unusual role reversals, carnivalesque performances, costumes, jest, drunken carousing, and the casting of lots by officials in the realm to determine the eponym for the year ahead. A hidden socio-spiritual subtext employed by the exilic community enabled them to play out their criticisms of Persia under the safe guise of imperial merrymaking. feigning compliance, the people of God performed an alternative story with a secret message of resistance and mockery that unsettled the sneaky power of the empire that lulled the Jews into comfort and royal consciousness through Persian assimilation. Joining in with the anarchy, royal roasting, and comical irreverences, the Jews used the cover of the holiday to perform their own spiritual political theater. The farce of the early rulers' pomp and authority and the comical work of fate made space for a quiet renewal of the Jewish belief in God's universal power and unending reach. Purim marks the one time in the Jewish calendar when midrashic prescriptions suspend social patterns and invert the moral order. Typically, the reading of Torah marks the climactic center of Jewish worship. The scrolls are paraded through the people to shows of dignity, respect, and reverence. On Purim, the scroll of Esther replaces Torah, and in contrast to normative quiet veneration, chaos and irreverence erupt. Shouting, stomping, hissing, and the clashing of cymbals or rocks drowns out the name of Haman. Cheering and exultation follow every mention of Mordecai. In defiance of typical rules, encouraging sobriety and restraint, Jewish teaching insists upon the imbibing of alcohol excessively on Purim, so much so that one can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. The holiday not only permits, but incites exaggerations and mimicry as young people mock rabbis, mentors, and community elders and violate biblical laws by gambling, cross-dressing, and carousing. This theater of opposites, embraced on Purim, upends the normative pattern of power hierarchies, social decorum, solemnity, and even holiness codes. The scroll offers a new political and cultural subtext in the irony and parody of each performance. The phenomenological background insists that each reenactment criticizes specific tyrants and resists contemporary politics of oppression in the present, even as it recalls the ancient exilic tale. So what can we learn from the background of Purim to inspire prophetic imagination in the context of new empires? There are many concrete takeaways, but let me suggest two that focus on trauma-informed spirituality. First, political performances and other works of art act as potent resources for spiritual awakening, prayer, and mobilizing action. Of course, Esther does not fall within the canonical prophets. Nevertheless, the scroll shares similar dramaturgical features and manifests the spiritual and creative sensibilities that are necessary for evoking prophetic imagination. Esther provides a paradigmatic mode of seeing that proves particularly effective for generating incisive critiques of totalizing institutional and cultural powers. Recognizing that the story of Esther was and is performed reaffirms the necessity for the artistic dimension of the life of faith. Second, the world behind the text of Esther demands a place for levity in leadership amid extremity. The call for energizing work corresponds with Brueggemann's second feature of prophetic imagination. He writes, "It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination." Contemporary pop culture demonstrates the galvanizing effect of satire for reweaving new social fabric in the narrative wreckage that follows traumatic events. In my context, in the US, late night television like Trevor Noah, Saturday Night Live, and Stephen Colbert, music artists like Polo G, Labyrinth, Billie Eilish, Taylor Swift, and NF, painters like Scott Erickson, and comedy series like Mo, Abbott Elementary, and Ted Lasso masterfully use humor, sarcasm, political mimicry, and compelling storytelling to offer commentary on issues like immigration, the war machine, misogyny, racism, environmental degradation, mental health, inequity, and injustices of all kinds. A reading of the world behind the text of Esther reminds the community of faith of the dialogism inherent in great art and the efficacy of myth for nourishing religious life. Turning to the world of the text, we'll offer further strategies for the kind of language that evokes prophetic consciousness. Scholar Carolyn Forche emphasizes the shattering effect of political trauma on the prophet's vocabulary and speech. The form of the text is not a means to an extra literary end, but a representation of extremity itself, making the ghosts of those haunting memories come alive again in each retelling. To this end, examining the world of the text will show how the doubleness, dualities, and inversions of the text evoke a scathing criticism of imperial power while energizing an alternative imagination of life together. Let me begin with a brief visual and dramatic retelling of the plot using the themes of foolishness and wisdom, hiding and uncovering, and disobedience to chart the fall and the rise of the text. The plot begins with the banquet of King Ahasuerus, who, after about 6 months of drunken partying with imperial ministers, has exhausted ideas for providing entertainment and proof of his unsurpassed wealth and importance. To continue his self-indulgence and shows of superiority, he proves his idiocy and arrogance further by calling for his wife, Queen Vashti, who, according to the gendered norms of the times, was hosting the dignitaries' wives in a separate set of feasts. The fool king orders her to parade herself, presumably naked, before the lustful gazes of his guests, to show that he has the most beautiful woman as his consort. She refuses her husband's command, and her disobedience leads to her disappearance, read either as exile or more likely as death. The drunken vengeance incited by the fragile masculinity of the fool king leads to 2 equally ridiculous pieces of counsel. Seeking to cure Ahasuerus of his sullenness and his bad temper after realizing that he misses his wife, the royal sages suggest a beauty pageant. Since foolish leaders listen to foolish advice, King Ahasuerus follows the admonitions of his administration and implements 2 drastic and dangerous policies. First, he sets forth a decree insisting that, quote, every man should be the master of his house, end quote, in order to stamp out any female rebellion incited by Vashti's insolence. Second, he sends out emissaries to forcibly conscript all the virgins in his lands into a harem where he systematically brings them to his bed to determine which one pleases him the most. The unchosen become concubines, while the one who he most enjoys becomes his new queen. Enter Esther, the obedient, submissive, and sexually acquiescent, a stark contrast to the subversive Vashti, whose defiance has led to her objection against the king's licentious appetites. The king celebrates his new compliant wife with a second scene of feasting. At this fete, the hero, who has already hidden her Jewish name Hadassah and assimilated by adopting a Persian name Esther, is now given a new title and new name as queen. The party is literally juxtaposed to Queen Esther's second banquet as host, where she uncovers her Jewish identity and the complicity of her fool husband in bringing about her promised destruction. But first, her inauguration is followed by the introduction of a subplot that focuses on Esther's relative Mordecai, the one who originally instructed Hadassah to conceal her ethnicity and blend in to survive the king's campaign of sexual terror. He has moved to Susa to keep an eye on his beloved Esther. This motif of hiddenness puts him in an uncanny position to eavesdrop on an unfolding scene that is a scheme to kill the king. This enables him to thwart the plot and make his way into the annals of the kingdom. The doubleness of the text, which we will examine later, cannot be understated at this point. Mordecai has been cast as the doppelganger to Haman, the vizier of the king. When one is humbled, the other is elevated. When one's cause is advanced, the other's collapses. And so the next banquet of Haman occurs as a celebration of the vizier's authorship of the text's next decree. When Haman comes to power, Mordecai refuses to bow, and presumably due to the Jewish covenant commitment to worship no one other than God. So Haman makes a scapegoat of his enemy, vowing to eliminate all Jews from the empire. To elicit royal support, he tells the fool king that the plundered households of this large ethnic group will engorge Ahasuerus' coffers with even greater riches. The fool king, once again, listens to foolish advice, and he gifts his signet ring to the author of this genocide. Basking in his newfound power, Haman hosts a banquet, one dialectically opposed to the later banquet hosted by Queen Esther, where she initiates his demise. This leads to the centerpiece of the narrative, a set of actions that I call the Great Inversion. This double interaction between Mordecai and Esther, the two protagonists, leads to a dual reversal. First, a code switch where they exchange roles of disobedience and obedience, and a reversal of fortunes, moving them from a place of political precarity and social instability to political prominence and socio-spiritual action. The dialogic exchange between Mordecai and Esther catalyzes a transformation in the queen that not only empowers her inwardly by inspiring boldness and endowing wisdom, but also activates her outwardly as she makes her first move as a political agent of change. Her quiet survivalism turns to shrewd discernment. Buoyed by a vision of holy disobedience, she designs a clever strategy for upending her enemy and liberating her people from assured destruction. In an ironic twist, the wise queen uses the vices of the fool king by inviting him to a series of two banquets. At the first, she hosts Ahasuerus and Haman by asking for nothing other than their company at a second feast. Intoxicated with self-importance, but still seething at the sight of Mordecai's resistance, Haman constructs a stake on which he plans to impale his literary opposite. But at the subsequent fete, Esther unveils her identity as a Jew to her husband and names Mordecai as the mastermind behind her impending execution. The fool king storms off in a childish show of indignation. Meanwhile, Haman throws himself on the couch of the queen, where she is reclining beside the dinner table. When the king returns, he, ironically, explodes at the brazenness of his vizier, who's advancing towards his wife in a sexually vulnerable position. In a twisted about face, the king impales Haman on the very stake built for his enemy. Esther discloses her relationship to Mordecai, inspiring the king to appoint him as the new vizier and gift him with the same signet ring that once initiated the extermination plan aimed at the Jews. In a climactic and comic end, Esther bravely beseeches the fool king again as the impending genocide approaches. Distraught by the irreversibility of the edict of ethnic cleansing he once approved, the mock king embraces his powerlessness, and thus he grants authority to Esther and Mordecai to creatively imagine a resolution. Mordecai authors a letter to the entire kingdom allowing for 2 days of preemptive strikes by Jews against their haters. Following these days of vengeance, terror strikes at the heart of the entire kingdom, such that no one dares to lift a hand against the Jews on the day set forth by Haman's decree. Mordecai establishes the traditions of Purim, and Queen Esther writes into law a command that the story be observed and performed every year in perpetuity. The exaggerated doubleness, dualities, and inversions of the text provide a humorous cadence to the terrifying tale of attempted extermination. Notice the litany of twos. 2 queens, 2 names of Hadassah Esther, 2 viziers, 2 kings, 1 visible drunken buffoon king of Persia, and 1 hidden wily king of the Jews, 2 policies following the king's first banquet. Twice Esther sends her eunuch to clothe and quiet Mordecai's protest, and 2 times he disobeys her. 2 decrees of violence, 1 by Haman and 1 by Mordecai, 2 banquets hosted by Queen Esther, and 2 days of preemptive violence by the Jews. 2 letters written by 2 protagonists to establish 2 days of Forum. In addition, opposing poles offer ripe opportunities in the text for dramatic inversions. The unlikely resolution of dissonances casts the egregious themes of this text in a comic register. The fool king, whose drunken power leads to dangerous decrees of pride after the first banquet, gives way to the wise queen, whose cool and calm power aims to protect in a decree following the last. Sexual exploits that expose and violate both queens at the beginning give way to the king's staunch defense of the body of Esther at the end. the oppression of Mordecai and elevation of Haman flips upside down, with the demise of Haman correlating with the political advancement of Mordecai. The genocidal decree of Haman becomes a death knell for the bloodthirsty and greedy enemies of the Jews. And the obedient and acquiescent Hadassah, whose deference, duty, and resignation leave her numbed by her trauma, gives way to a disobedient Queen Esther who resists, risks, and authors justice. The great reversal that marks the centerpiece of the entire drama also includes a profound gendered transposition. Once Queen Esther has assimilated to privileged palace living, she sees Mordecai at the gate making a scene in the city. Clothed in sackcloth and covered in ash, her uncle takes on the prophetic performance of lamentation, bitterly decrying the impending annihilation of the Jews. With haste, Esther sends her eunuch out with clothes and a letter requesting that Mordecai cease making a scene. Mordecai, consistent with his textual development thus far in the plot, disobeys and orders Esther to supplicate before the king. A second time, Esther sends out her eunuch to inform her uncle that the king has not asked to see her in many days, and reminds him that approaching the king without invitation would be a death sentence. Mordecai replies with a warning that the queen not deceive herself by thinking that she will escape the slaughter. He impels her to consider her position of power and privilege as a gift to be used in dangerous, terrifying times. He, all of a sudden, in an instant, instigates a complete change. Everything reverses. Esther experiences some kind of internal conversion, which initiates a complete socio-political transformation. She becomes unsubmissive, uncontrollable, and unafraid. She instructs Mordecai to organize a fast among all the Jews in Susa on her behalf, and she dares to rise and embrace disobedience to beseech the king's favor, even if she may perish in the cause. In perfect literary coherence, the text reads, Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther ordered him. Thus, Mordecai becomes obedient and compliant as Esther steps into the role of daring and disobedient leader. How Esther moves precariously but prudently from obedient and acquiescent to courageous and defiant offers wisdom for discerning action amid extremity. The binaries and polarities of this text give way to paradox through profound inversions. Two strategies for trauma-informed spirituality emerge as principles: hybridity and humility for daring leadership. The concluding elevation of not only Esther, but also Mordecai shows a form of hybridity in the text itself that resists either or interpretations that position one protagonist over the other as the preeminent savior. Similarly, the way that both obedience and disobedience emerge as paths of wisdom shows a particular logic for living under empire. The text itself resists dogmatism and rules-based spirituality for discerning and embraces heterogeneity, two antidotes to the homogenizing and controlling tactics of empire. The humility of Esther in listening to her uncle by hiding her identity and later in risking herself to save her people exemplifies a posture necessary for navigating spiritual and political life under royal consciousness. Mordecai also emerges as a paragon of humility, especially as he is written in stark opposition to the prideful Haman. Mordecai's discernment of holy action, though, is set in diametric contrast to that of Esther's in the first half of the dramatic structure, where Esther violates covenant by hiding her Jewishness, assimilating into Persian court politics, and even marrying a pagan king in violation of Jewish law. She nevertheless obeys Mordecai's commands, exemplifying a form of holy disobedience. Mordecai, in opposition to Hadassah, insists on maintaining his public practices of Jewish covenant by defying Haman's command to bow before him. He too shows a form of holy disobedience. After the great reversal, Esther's wisdom manifests in audacious rebellion and clever political action, whereas Mordecai exercises quiet reserve through fasting, waiting, and praying. This model of hybridity in living humbly shows a way beyond the binaries and polarities of imperial thinking, one that embraces differing and even divergent paths to holiness. This encourages the faithful to discern their spiritual social action even as they dialogue and call each other to greater accountability and better action, working together to actualize an alternative community. By way of conclusion, let me offer a final synthesis of how this paradigmatic biblical story yields meaning for the world in front of the text. The mode of seeing in Esther holds a unique capacity for yielding multiple meanings. The theater of Purim also demonstrates how participative reenactments act as method. This reminds contemporary readers of the importance of liturgies, collective lament, and laughter for building empathy with others, offering outlets for emotional expression, and creating social bonds in situations of community disintegration. Myriad studies show that dark humor works as an emotional coping mechanism and an empowerment technique among those who are experiencing trauma. The grim humor of Esther and the exaggerated idealism of its plot demonstrate a courageous clinging to life from despair through audacious hope. Building on these social fibers that emerge in the narrative wreckage following extremity through the work of prophetic imagination, socio-spiritual action takes root. Here, the disobedience and doubleness of Esther are instructive. Prayer and political action go hand in hand. Disobedience and dialogue also work together. Discernment replaces dogmatism. Redressing injustices offers the way forward toward reconciliation and recreation of society. The priority of Esther's survival at the beginning of the story finally gives way to a radical act of self-sacrificing courage, manifesting a messiahship that points forward to the greatest inversion realized in Christ's self-sacrifice that overturns the curse of death. The final scenes of the scroll evidence an altogether different utopian image of the perfect kingdom, one where peace, charity, celebration, and remembrance sit uneasily beside violence, grief, and lament. This final scene alone invites further conversation, resistance, and reinterpretation. My hope remains that this reading of the story of Esther will offer strategies for nourishing spirit-led discernment in the socio-spiritual life of those seeking to overcome their own dangerous drunken kings. Thank you.